Now, can you hear me? Please raise your hand if you can. Okay. Now I will continue with the teaching. As I was just saying, I mentioned that India has been able to preserve many ancient traditions. For example, like commonly, Indian people generally do not speak Sanskrit, but educated Brahmins still continue to speak and write in Sanskrit. And they also continue to write texts in Sanskrit. And this tradition is exactly the same as it was before the common era. So that's one example. The second example is, these days, when we are printing books, there's been a huge improvement in printing technology. Still, the Brahmins write out the Sanskrit texts out by hand, following the ancient customs and practice. And so that tradition of writing manuscripts by hand still continues. That's another example. Another example is that there was the king Alexander the Great, who was a Greek king. He was very well known. And so before he invaded India, so this is what we're saying is it's probably 3 or 4 centuries before the Common Era. So before that time, there was a custom of memorizing the texts of the Vedas, and they still maintained this tradition of memorizing the texts of the Vedas, the same as it was before the Common Era. And so for that reason, many ancient texts were burned in the intervening centuries, but the Brahmins are still able to recite the text from memory exactly and without any hesitation. And this is also pretty amazing. So that's another example. And another example is that another example of them preserving ancient Indian traditions is that when they're doing fire pujas, you need fire, right? So now we need to light a fire, and we don't really worry about where the fire comes from. What the Brahmins do, they start all the fires for fire pujas by rubbing sticks. They rub a stick on another stick, and because of that rubbing, then the fire comes, right? And so they maintain this tradition of lighting fires in this way. And this is a tradition from many thousands of years ago, from prehistory. But that custom is still preserved in India. So when the Brahmins do fire pujas, they absolutely have to rub the fire sticks together. And they practice that exactly the same now. And so for these reasons, there are many customs of preserving ancient Indian traditions and knowledge. And so we can understand where do their customs and history come from, and where does their knowledge come from. It's really beneficial for us to knowing that now. So So being able to maintain traditions from thousands of years before in the past is not present really in any other country. And so for that reason, the researchers from many different areas take particular interest in India and they study Indian history and civilization in particular. So that's one thing. However, one thing we need to understand, and if we speak about it bluntly, actually, India is a country without any history. Or to explain it clearly, actually, it's not that not only they have to, when you have the history, they're recording dates. There aren't any recorded dates from Indian history. And the reason for this when contemporary scholars think about, examine it, the reason why there is not much of a tradition of recording dates in history is because the Aryan peoples, there's an Aryan people is an ethnic group, and we'll speak about them later. So the Aryan peoples, and the people who were educated were the Brahmins. And the Brahmins would teach the people, and they would teach people, and they would advise people what they should think, and they would examine, or they'd have a limit on the way people think. And so the way they advise other people is they would advise people that the human life is suffering by nature. There's a lot of suffering in human life, and so it's suffering by nature. And so in order to lead a human life, you have to commit many misdeeds. And so it is full of suffering of misdeeds. And so we need to remove ourselves from that human life that's full of suffering and misdeeds. And so we need to separate, and so we don't record the dates and so forth. And there's no need to record the dates for the human history. And for that reason, they didn't take any interest at all in recording dates in history. Not only did they take no interest in history, when we look at Indian history, when we think about 400, the history of India before 400 BC is completely empty. It's a complete blank. And the reason is that there aren't any manuscripts connected. There's no foundation for research. And without a foundation, you can't research, right? So for that reason, if a contemporary scholar wants to research Indian history before 400 BC, the only way they have to look at it is to look at the extant or the remaining Indian texts from that time. And they look at the topics talked about in this, and they can say that, probably at this time, this person happened. And probably they kind of estimate when people must have lived and so forth. And so it's mainly estimation and guess. But when you look at, if you need to research based upon literary, it's difficult to understand how much you can, because these aren't historical manuscripts, they are literary manuscripts. So you look at literary manuscripts and you take out the history. If you need to take out the history, it's actually out of the literature. It's very difficult. In particular, all of the Indian manuscripts are written with a really living feeling. It's like everything is real. And because they're written with that feeling, when we look at the literary manuscripts, what is real and what is fiction? What is actual history? What was written by the author? It's hard to tell. Everything's written as if it's real and if it's true. So even if we come to the very final point, the literary histories determining how much of it is fact and how much of it is fiction is something that the researcher themselves has to guess and estimate, because it's hard, because we don't have separate historical documents, and so we have to then use our minds and guess. And so for that reason, ancient Indian history, when we research it, the feeling we have is it's like we've gone into like completely black pitch darkness and we're looking for a thing. And the reason, because you're in this into the completely this place where you can't see anything, you just have to stumble around looking for it. Another thing we need to know: not only was there no one who recorded history in letters, in writing, not only was there no one recording the history, there wasn't even anyone who researched into it. If they, even without the recorded history, if they had researched, they could have known something. So when was it that research in the Indian history began? It's only in the 18th century that research into Indian history began. And the main reason why it began is that at that time, that this was the time when the British took control of India. And so there was a viceroy in India, the British viceroy in India, who took interest in Indian culture. And so he encouraged people strongly to study and research Indian history. And so because of that, some people from European countries, whether from England or Germany or France, because of that, these scholars came to study Indian history. So basically, the beginning of study of Indian history was begun by European academics. But in terms of the day, all over the world, there are historians studying Indian history and culture all over the world. There are quite a few of them, right? In any case, so for that reason, we could say that the duration of time in which Indian history has been researched and studied is no more than about 200 years ago. It's actually a country with an incredibly long history, but the research into it, there's only been a short time when there's been research into Indian history. So if we need to study the history of India, what texts do we have that we can study? And to talk about it in general, if we would like to know about the events in history before 400 BCE, there is no choice but to use the texts from ancient India that remain. But those texts that remain from ancient India are primarily religious texts, or they are literary works that were heavily influenced by religion. And within those, they do describe to a certain degree what the society of that time was like. But mixed in with all those stories are there many myths or many stories from the Vedas. So it's difficult to say that they're actual historical documents. So now, what are these religious texts or these literary texts? I want to talk about the religious texts. We're primarily talking about the Vedas. And the literary works are primarily, they're the two. There's talking about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. So those are the two main sources. So the Aryan people arrived in India from another country, and they arrived in the area called Punjab. And so if we want to understand the history of the 1,000-year period from about 1500 BC to the 500 BC, after the Aryan people settled in Punjab, we have to look at the Vedas and the literary works such as the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. So when we had Now, when people from outside of India, people from foreign countries learned about India, this began at the time of Alexander Great, the famous Greek emperor who fought wars in many different countries. And he moved to the east to wage war in India. And that was the first time that people knew that there was that region or that country called India. That's when they first learned about it. That's when people from other countries first learned of India. And Alexander, when Emperor Alexander passed away, he had a general who later became later became Seleucus I Nicator. I'm not certain about how to say the name, but he became a king. Later, first he was a general, but later he took took the capital and became the emperor himself. And that emperor sent Seleucus I, sent Megasthenes, a person named Megasthenes, as an ambassador, as his representative to India. And the place he sent him to was to the central India in the region of Magadha. If you divide India from east, west, north, and south, and in the middle is the region of Magadha, and that's the region he sent them. This is the area around present-day Bodh Gaya. And when Megasthenes was sent to India, he recorded in writing everything he saw or heard, experienced, and wrote a book called the Indica. And there are 4 volumes to this book. And this 4-volume text was spread widely. But what's disappointing about that is that the actual text itself is no longer extant. It has been lost. Later, but we can find the citations from that work that other people quoted in their own works. So in any case, he went to India. And when he came back, he said, I went to India. I went to this country named India. And he wrote down all the experiences and what he saw and heard. And he spread it when he distributed it to everyone. And everyone didn't believe what he was writing about it. They said, it's impossible. There couldn't possibly be this country called India. And no one believed it. And the reason for that is that it was different than these days. You say there's a country called India, and people would be like just amazed. And in particular, at that time, India was a very highly developed country. And so people would just be too surprised, and they're so surprised that they wouldn't believe it. In any case, what it describes describes the situation in the period of the 4th century BCE. And so for this reason, for people who are researching history, this is like an invaluable, priceless text. Now, all the history before that, as I said before, and so like no one person went there and wrote down their experiences. So there's no such source. So at that point, Megasthenes wrote it down his own experience. And before that, we have to look at the Vedas and the literary texts, and we have to infer and deduce from those texts. And so we can't really say with any great degree of certainty that this event happened, that this personages occurred. So it's difficult to say that. Later then, in the 4th century CE, so not before the Common Era, but in the Common Era, in the 4th century, In the end of the 4th century, the Chinese monk, the Chinese Buddhist monk, he was an acharya, and his name in Chinese is called Fa Xian. If you translate that into English, it's Dharma light. So the light of Dharma. So Fa Xian. So Fa Xian crossed many different rivers and valleys to travel to India. And when he arrived there, and after he returned to India, he recorded everything he saw in India, and he wrote what is called the Travels to the Noble Land. It's called the Foguo Ji in Chinese. And so this is a 4th century text. And then in the 7th century, there was the Tang Xunsang, who's very well known, right? So many of you have read the Pew Pakpa television series. When you look at those films, there's Tang Sen, who's always saying Amitofo, and that is him. The one in the Pew Pakpa series is like made into like a story, but I'm talking about the actual Xunsang. Tang Xunsang also went to India, and he was also a holder of the Tripitaka in China, and he crossed the deserts to travel to India. And he traveled to all the different regions of India, to many different regions in the south, north, east, west, and central India. And he wrote about Indian politics, their customs, and researched many of these. And in the end, he wrote his text called The Great Tang Records on the Western Regions. And this is an extremely important text. Then at the end of the 7th century, there was another Chinese master who traveled to that. So his name in Chinese is Yi Jing, and his name, if you translate it, is the pure meaning. And he traveled by the sea. So this time through the region of Calcutta. So he travels through Bengal and West Bengal to come to India. And after he returned to India, he wrote a text called A Record of the Buddhist Practices Sent Home from the Southern Sea. So these 3 texts written by the 3 Chinese Buddhist masters are, even to this day, they are still contained within the Chinese Buddhist canon. So these texts by the 3 texts by the Buddhist, by the Chinese Buddhist scholars are very important and had a great influence on research. And so everyone, in particular, the Tang Xunsang's great record of the Western religions, it's the most highly regarded, and it's the most helpful one. Right now, these days, we've been able to identify all the major Buddhist sites and say this is this and this is that. And the reason we were able to do this is because of this text by Tang Xunsang. That is why we're able to identify the Buddhist sites. If there were no such book, we'd have great difficulty identifying what are the major Buddhist sites, the Buddhist sacred sites. So in brief, so I was speaking about the 4th and the 7th century. So and up into the 13th century, up to the 13th century, there are not very many historical records of Indian history, just a few. From the 13th century on, the Muslim invaders came to so it's not exactly what we can say. It's not there, and I'll talk about the reasons why later. But basically, it was, from the time India came under the power of the Muslim kings, then they record the dates of the dates of reigns and the stories of events and historical personages. And from that point, they began to take interest in recording history. But before the 13th century ancient Indian history, if we need to speak about that, as I said before, we've got the text written by the Greek Megasthenes, as well as the text by the Chinese Buddhist masters, as well as the rock edicts and cave edicts carved in the time of the Emperor Ashoka. And those are the sources we have to learn about Indian history. So if we think about the history of India from Indian civilization from prehistory until now, so what is the earliest that we can speak about? So India happened what we called as in the Stone Age. That was a time when people used tools, tools that were made of stone. They didn't have any tools made out of bronze or out of iron. So if we look at the archaeological evidence, we can understand that. I'm not able to really describe it well now, but in any case, this is the age when they only used stone tools. And if we kind of look at that, so basically, it's been a few 10,000s of years that human beings have been living in India. And the reason is that they are finding the things and the bones and the evidence, archaeological evidence that has been unearthed from that time. And so basically we say, what is the earliest time that humans appeared in India? That is that. So if we think about, it's been a few 10,000s of years since that time. But when we think about the actual Indian civilization, there are many ways to describe it, but basically the main thing you need writing. So you need writing and many other factors, but when you think about an Indian civilization, what is the beginning of that? It's probably around 3,000 years before the Common Era. So somewhere around 3,000 BC. Some from around that time, if we think about that till now, we still talk about so that's basically, if you think about between 4,000 BC and the 13th century, we've got to think about like ancient history is contained in that period from 3,000 BC until about 1200 AD. And so that's about 4,000 years. That's the length, the duration of Indian history. And so when we think about that period of 4,000 years, that was the particular Indian country. Now, from that time, from the 12th century and 13th century, then from that time, the Drogu kings, or we call the Gurdid emperors, the members of the Gurdid kings, and they're from the Gurdid place, and they're Muslim, and they invaded India. And from that time onward, then India became a Muslim country. And that their dynasty continued for around 300 or 400 years. And then finally, after that, later in the 16th century, there was the Mughals. They were Mongolian, and they were also Muslims, and they invaded India. And when they invaded India, they mostly destroyed or extirpated earlier Indian culture and civilization. And so for that time on, there's basically nothing left of Buddhism in India but ruins. And so it's like this is the beginning of a new era in Indian civilization. So later that, of course, a new civilization, new Indian culture did thrive, of course. But if we compare it with that 4,000-year brilliant Indian earlier civilization, the particular vast Indian civilization, if we compare the two, it's like There's no way you can compare them, many scholars say.
I
think I might be having a technical problem. Please wait a moment. I've had a technical problem. Okay. So you had to, I'm sorry, you had to wait. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Wait, raise your hands. Okay. So what I was speaking about is from the time that the Gurdjieff invaders arrived in India and they established emperors. So I don't know if it's like 300 or 400 years. It's not. It might have been more than 340 years, but I don't remember exactly clearly. So I'm not certain that that is exactly right. Anyways, in brief, basically what we're speaking about now, and we're thinking about in the summer teaching, when we're thinking about the history of Indian civilization, what we need to understand is that we need, if we divide into history into four major periods, then it is easier for us to understand. So I'd like to divide it into these four major periods. So here are the periods. So these four great periods of Indian civilization, the first of these is the Indus Valley Civilization. Another name for it is the Harappan Civilization, or the Indus River Civilization. And the dates of this civilization are from some of the 3400 BC to about 1600 BCE. And the second period is the Vedic period. This is probably started around 16th century BCE to the 6th century BCE. And the third period is the Buddhist period. This is the name I'm giving it. And this period is from the 6th century BCE until the 13th century of the Common Era. I think that's probably a fair way to describe it. And then the fourth is the period of the disappearance of Buddhism. This means the disappearance of Buddhism in India. And so this is basically Buddhism disappeared from India from the 13th century onward. So from that point onward, I'm not going to speak. I'm not going to speak about that time onward. So among these, the first of these periods, to give a brief overview of it, the first period probably began around 330 BC. Its greatest extent, the greatest extent of that civilization, the greatest spread, was from around 2600 BCE to about 1900 BCE. And so in between that time is the greatest extent of the Indus Valley civilization. And that civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, and the people who developed it or who maintained it were the Dravidian peoples. This is like a type of people. This is an ethnic group. Now, the second period is the Vedic period. And the Vedic period basically began around 1600 BCE. And the people who instituted this civilization, the main personages or the characters were the Aryan people. Now, the Aryan peoples came from a different region into India. So there were new arrivals into it. And when they arrived in India, they settled in the region of Punjab, and they stayed there. They had a lot of devotion and faith in nature and rivers and the earth and trees and so forth. And they offered praises and worship to nature. That was their tradition. And if you think about the basis for studying that the history of that time are among the four of the Vedas. Among the four Vedas is primarily the Rig Veda. Now, the Aryan peoples continued to move towards the east, and they arrived in the Ganges River Valley, and they settled permanently there. Not only did they stay there, they established many powerful kingdoms in that region. And at the same time as that, we have the caste system in India, right? The higher and lower castes. This is very significant, isn't it? So that was the time when the caste system was developed. And there's also a time the Brahmin caste having great power was established, determined at that time. And so during that period, the educated Brahmins compiled the four Vedas. So before that, there was the Rig Veda, and then they compiled all the other Vedas into what we call the four Vedas. They also wrote the texts such as the Brahmana. It's a very important Indian text, right? And then the Upanishads. These are also these are two important texts, and so they originated from that period as well. Likewise, the great Indian literary works, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. So these great literary works were also written, these great epics were written at this time. So this Vedic period was an area that provided a lot for Indian culture. Later, the Aryan peoples began to gain control over all of India. So basically most of India. They began to take control of India at that time. Not only that, there were many different, the four Vedas and other literary works, right? And so on the basis of these, they developed these six non-Buddhist philosophies, including the Samkhya and so forth, including what we call the Astika and the Nastika. So these are the six non-Buddhist schools that their presentations all developed from that time. Not only those six schools, there are also many other views and philosophies that stopped. Now we talk about the names. So I think most of those different times, we talk about all the non-Buddhist philosophies, they mostly originated at that time. Also, the Jain religion also arose during this Vedic period. So that's the second period, the Vedic period. Now the third period is the Buddhist period. And we say the Buddhist period, and when did it start? It started around the end of the 6th century BC, when the Buddha was born. Of course, there are many different positions on when the Buddha was born. Still, but what's most widely accepted these days says that he was born at the end of the 6th century BC. That's the primary explanation. So from the end of the 16th century BCE, the Buddha was born, and the teachings of Buddhism began. And then from that time on, the kings of that time supported Buddhism greatly. And because of their support of Buddhism, Buddhism spread widely. And because it spread widely, then the Brahmins also had a lot of influence and a high position, and that decreased their influence. It's kind of like a defeat or a loss for them. And then after that, in the central regions, there's the Emperor Ashoka. And Emperor Ashoka was the first one to unite India. Not only did he unite India, he also established Buddhism as like the royal or the state religion. He recognized it as the royal religion. So at that time, there was a council. We talk about the Buddhist councils, right? We talk about the first, second, and third councils, right? The first council kind of some does some. We can talk about the councils later if there is time. But in any case, the councils began from that time. Similarly, in South India, there was another powerful kingdom called the Andhra in South India. And at the same time, in the north, there was the Gupta dynasty. In the west, there was the Bactrians people. They came through the northwest and they arrived in India. And among their people, there was one of their kings who was called Kanishka. The first Kanishka king, Kanishka, came there. So Kanishka came. He converted to Buddhism. And because there are many different kings who really respected Buddhism, and so because within India itself, Buddhism spread greatly within India, and also it spread outside of India to many different countries. And so it spread greatly throughout the world. And at that time, it became a world religion. Later, in the north of India, there was a king who really supported the Hindu religion and supported the Brahmins. His name was Vikramaditya. And so he supported the Brahmanic religion very strongly. And so because of that, and so when the Buddhism had spread widely, then Brahmanism decreased. But then later with that king in northern India, when Vikramaditya appeared in northern India, he supported the Brahmanism. The Brahmanism once again began to spread. So Buddhism and Brahmanism became like opponents of each other, like enemies or opponents of each other. They were kind of equal in strength, and so between the two of them, there are always debates and disputes and conflicts. So this Brahmanist religion, this is like the new Brahmanism. The old Brahmanism had decreased, and so the new Brahmanism was a slightly different form arise. Later, there was a king named called Harshvardhana. So in Sanskrit, it's probably Harshvardhana. He's called in Tibetan Suchunima. He also supported Buddhism greatly. He was a very strong patron of Buddhism, and because of that, then Buddhism once again began to be really very strong. But at that time, it's like the Buddhism was actually, this is probably the 7th century during that time, 7th and 8th century. It was not as strong as Buddhism had previously been. So that is the third time, the third period, the Buddhist period. The fourth period is the period of the disappearance of Buddhism. And so what this time is, and so there was what we call the Arab Caliphate. And so the Arab Caliphate, they invaded India several times. They came from the Arabs and they invaded India several times. Later, after they had invaded many times, primarily it was that they're the Afghanistani, there's a Turkic people who lived in Afghanistan. These days they're called Turkic in English, right? They invaded India, and in the end, in the 13th century, they took control over India, and they also, in the region of Delhi, they caused the Delhi Sultanate. This is the first Muslim dynasty within India. And because of that, the Buddhism was just suffered great loss and destruction, but Buddhism did remain in a few areas. But it was kind of like at that time, so you couldn't really tell if it was living or dying. It was a very difficult situation, very weak. And then at the very end, and this, the absolute destruction of Buddhism, when it left destroyed from India without a trace, was in the 16th century, when the Mughals, these are Mongolians, right? So they're Mongolians, but their religion is Islam, and they invaded India and established the Mughal dynasty in India. And after they established the Mughal dynasty, it was even more stricter than the previous dynasties, and so they converted all of India to Islam, and Buddhism was destroyed in India and erased from India without a trace. And so these four stages are what we're speaking about in the Indian, or during the summer teaching, we're dividing Indian history into four periods or areas. Actually, when you think about the actuality, if you're studying Indian history, there's no standard single way of dividing the eras of Indian history. The reason for this is that there's so many different countries or kingdoms within India. If you have it all a single country, then you have dynasties. But if you have so many different separate, scattered, fragmented kitchens, and so the country was not united. And not only was it not united, if we look at the map of India from present day, there are only a few times when India was united. Other than that, it's generally been fragmented. There are only a few periods when it was a united country. One was during the time of King Ashoka. Then later, the Mughal dynasty managed to mostly unite India, as scholars say. And then when the British took control over India, it was basically united. Other than that time, most of the time, it was not united. So it was all fragmented. And so that was the situation. And so because of that, when you have so many different countries and many different kings, sometimes the kings, they got along well. Sometimes they fought. Sometimes one would conquer another. So they would support each other. And so they had a very chaotic situation. And so if we wanted to divide the history of India into periods by dynasties, it's very difficult. So when I'm dividing the history into periods now, it's primarily in terms of Buddhist history. That is, and the reason for that is we've got the period before Buddhism appeared, the period when Buddhism flourished, and the period when Buddhism had disappeared. And so if I'm dividing it primarily in terms of the Buddhist teachings, so the first and second periods are before the appearance of Buddha. The third period is when Buddhism flourished, and the fourth is the period when Buddhism disappeared. And so that's the way I'm describing it for this teaching. So now I don't have so much time. It's maybe better to speak about this first. So these days in India, we call it Hindustan or Hindu or Indu. We talk about India or Hindu. We have in Tibetan, we say Jakar. The way we explain it, there is a strange explanation of this. And you kind of wonder, how did this actually happen? I don't know if it's something you should believe or if it's credible or not. Or it's just an explanation that I don't know. So when we say Jakar for India in Tibetan, I can't really explain it clearly, but the reason why we usually say is that when you call India Hindustan, are called the Sindhu. And the reason why it was called that, I thought I'd speak about the reason why it's called by these names. And the reason that I need to discuss this is that when the Aryan peoples arrived in the Indian subcontinent, they arrived from the northwest. So where did they stay? They settled on the banks of the Sindhu River. The Sindhu or Indus River, in Tibetan we call it the, I think it's what we call the Sindhu Kaba. And so where does it originate? It comes from the it's from the Mount Kailash in Tibet, and then it has many tributaries that flow into it, and then it flows down into the Arabian Sea. It flows down, so its source is in Tibet, and in the end, it flows into the Arabian Sea. And so, when you talk about the name Hindu, that name it was given because of this river. This river is called in Sanskrit, it's called Sindhu, but in Sanskrit, it is called Sindhu. Sindhu, and the reason why it's called Sindhu is because on either beside the people of that, now it's not a gentle river, it's a very powerful and it's got a very current and a lot of rapids. And so because it's they're always kind of afraid of that river. And so the reason they called it Sindhu is that Sindhu can mean, it means water or ocean. And because of that, so the people who lived along the regions around the river was called the Sindhu, in the Sindhu River, that's the Sindhu River Basin. And that eventually, the name of that river basin then became the ultimate name of it. So basically, first was named of the Indus River Valley, and later became the name of the entire India. So Hindu, the word Sindhu changed. How did it change to the word Hindu? It's because in old Persian language, Sindhu, when they read it, they said Hindu. Their pronunciation was Hindu, and so it was called Hindu. So later, that when in the ancient the Latin language, it was called India. Actually, in ancient Chinese, I think it's possible that they could have said Hindu, but the pronunciation of ancient Chinese or old Chinese and nowadays it's not certain. But in the old days, when the Chinese came to, I think that they probably called India Sindhu. However, but the old Indians didn't say of themselves that they were Hindu or Sindhu. They said they called them Bharat. They said, we come from the country of Bharata. Or they'd say that we're from Jambudvipa. They said from Jambudvipa. When you talk about the southern continent of Jambudvipa, right? When you say, hello, southern area of Jambudvipa, we think of all of the world as being Jambudvipa, but in ancient times, Jambudvipa was understood to mean the Indian subcontinent. And so for that reason, the ancient Indians didn't call themselves, I say, I'm Indian, I'm Hindu. In particular, the Persians would call their neighbors. So Persia and ancient Persia and ancient India are very close. So they're like neighboring countries. So they call their neighboring country Sindhu. And so I think that's how it came. First, the Persians gave this name. Later, the ancient Romans followed the Persians and calling it the Hindus, and later became Hindu and then India. And so I think that's how the relations came. And so it's only at that point that the name Hindu or India became well known. So that's how it is. Actually, I had a lot that I wanted to speak about today, but the time is been going very quickly. So we will leave it for there today, and I think that'll be okay. So now we recite the dedication prayers. Okay.
Lord,